Devil May Cry 2 is regarded by most people to be the black sheep of the series. It's also the first Devil May Cry game directed by this guy, Hideaki Itsuno. Although, it's not exactly his fault that DMC2 came out the way it did, as he didn't really have much time with the project. See, DMC2 wasn't actually done by Team Little Devils, like the first game. Instead, it was handed over to Capcom Production Team 1. According to an interview with Itsuno by Bobby Mackey on usgamer.com, development on DMC2 wasn't going terribly well, so Itsuno, who at the time had directed Rival Schools and Power Stone, was appointed to direct the project. He was brought on about halfway through development and replaced an unidentified director. Although he wasn't too successful in fixing things with DMC2, Itsuno went on to direct DMC3 and DMC4, which are highly regarded. Moving on to the game itself, it once again starts with a little description of Sparta and introduces Dante. This time around though, we're also introduced to a secondary character, Lucia. Lucia called Dante for an unknown reason. They have an encounter in some sort of museum, and then the first mission starts. After the first mission, Lucia's home is destroyed and we're introduced to Lucia's mother, who once fought alongside Sparta. She asked Dante to deal with Arius, a businessman who uses demonic powers and has transformed the land into a haven for demons. The insane businessman is trying to use ancient artifacts to become immortal. If Dante is successful in defeating him, then Lucia's mother will tell Dante a story about Sparta. Dante flips a coin and so begins a new adventure. Dante doesn't really get much more exposition in this game than the first one. In fact, he doesn't really say much in this game, he's more serious and silent. As you fight your way towards Arius and obtain the Ancient Arcana, you'll have to fight demons, buildings, tanks, and helicopters. Yep, I'm not kidding about that. Certain enemies and bosses in this game are infested tanks, helicopters, and a demonic building. Anyways, something you'll immediately notice when you open the game case, or if you're playing the HD version when you load up the game, is that you now have the option to play as a secondary character, Lucia. Playing as Lucia is more than just a reskin, however. I'll go more into how she plays in a minute, but she has some levels that are completely different than Dante and even has some cutscenes all to herself. She gets quite a bit more character growth than Dante, and it almost feels like she was meant to be the main character while Dante plays a secondary role. The voice acting and dialogue are a bit better this time around, with multiple characters having quite a few lines of dialogue. Except for Lucia's voice acting. I'm sure she's supposed to have a French accent, but it isn't consistent and tends to just sound weird most of the time. Other than that, the sound design in general is still pretty strong. The music outside of combat is still eerie and ambient, and in combat, the music has slightly more heavy rock tones and keeps its energetic nature. Sound effects from weapons are still weighty, although now that I think about it, a lot of enemies and bosses are actually pretty silent, or don't make much noise like in the first game. There's only one boss outside of Arius that I can think of that actually talks to the main characters. There's a few changes from the first game that are noticeable throughout the game. The mission structure from the previous game is kept the same. The orbs are mostly the same as the first game. You have your red orbs for currency, green orbs for healing, blue orbs and blue fragments for increasing HP, purple orbs to increase double trigger, but now you have an added white orb which recovers your double trigger, and gold orbs replace the yellow orbs. You can only carry one gold orb at a time, and upon death immediately revives you with full HP and double trigger. Items and upgrades in the shops have their prices increased dramatically, while the amount of red orbs from defeating enemies, beating missions, and finding secret stashes have more or less stayed the same. The combat has changed from the previous game. All moves are unlocked from the very beginning instead of needing to be bought, and different combos are done by tilting the stick in a direction during an attack string while not pressing the lock-on button, as opposed to DMC1 where your combos change from various timing on your button presses. Dante has Stinger while pressing the lock-on button and tilting forward, and he has air attacks in addition to Helmbreaker. Melee attacks cannot be cancelled during a combo unless it's to do Stinger or High Time. Characters have a dedicated dodge button now, along with a jump button instead of just having to use the jump button for dodging and jumping. One of the biggest changes, in my opinion, and a major reason DMC2 suffers, is that players cannot dodge or jump out of attacks like in the previous game. The animation has to play out before being allowed to dodge, which can lead to frustrating events like being hit because you can't dodge in time, even if you see the attack coming. This is true for guns as well, but they have a quicker animation, so it's easier to dodge when using them. When more guns are obtained, you can press the L2 button to quickly switch between them instead of having to pause and do it in a menu. Unfortunately, you can't do this for melee weapons. Another big change is that there are 3 melee weapons this time around. The catch is that they're all swords and have no variety to their combos. Your first sword does standard damage and attacks at moderate speed. One does more damage and attacks slightly slower. The other attack is slightly quicker but does less damage. Guns offer more variety in this game than melee weapons do. This also applies to Lucia's weapons. Both guns and swords can be upgraded in the shop instead of obtaining moves, and it's here that another major problem with DMC2 is found. Guns in this game are king. The guns in this game have high amounts of damage and knockback, enough that they knock most enemies into the sky and interrupt their attacks. The player can evade attacks easily because of the short animations when firing certain guns. In almost any given situation, the guns are the best option to use. Most things take a fair amount of damage from guns, so usually they're the best option to upgrade in the shop. Even a majority of the bosses can be fought with just the guns. Speaking of the bosses, for the most part, they're pretty lackluster this time around. There's more of them than DMC1, but they don't really do anything interesting, and they're all pretty trivialized by ranged attacks and Devil Trigger. The general strategy for bosses seems to be use your guns to build up Devil Trigger and then go in for melee attacks with Devil Trigger active, because you can kinda just tank the hits, or if you're up against one of the many flying bosses, use Devil Trigger to just do more ranged damage. Bosses have a ton of health, so fighting the flying types can take a ton of time because you're just chipping away at their health with guns. Even if they do come into range for melee attacks, they're just limited to the aerial attacks. I'm reiterating, but guns are simply the best way to do consistent damage, build Devil Trigger, and evade enemy attacks. Using the gun and Devil Trigger does a different attack which is closer to machine gun fire with higher damage. A big change for Devil Trigger that I think only appears in this game is that there is now an amulet that can be customized with different powers like flight, swimming, or speed, different elements, and increased power, increased healing, or the power to slow down time. Some bosses will take extra damage from different elements, but the elemental attacks only manifest when in Devil Trigger. This focus on guns puts a major damper on the combat. The style meter doesn't really help, in fact it actually facilitates using the guns. A style meter is extremely strict, going away almost immediately if you stop attacking. You can keep the meter up by shooting enemies, but it only increases if you attack using melee weapons or if you successfully dodge an enemy's attack. There's no real need to try fun combos since the meter can be increased by simply doing the same attack over and over again. Which is a shame because apart from the guns and the dodge issue, there are some fun and creative combos you can do. The game just won't reward you for doing them. The camera style is still the same as DMC1 with both static and dynamic camera angles, but in DMC2 there are more camera angles that follow the character, leading to fewer camera angles where the character is stuck between two different angles, but it does happen sometimes. It doesn't always mess with the 3D platforming in the game, but the 3D platforming isn't exactly smooth by itself. Luckily, there's less of a focus on that. Lengthwise, the game is about the same as the first one for a first playthrough, but that's if you play both Dante and Lucia's campaign. Like I said earlier, Lucia is more than just a reskin. She actually has different moves than Dante and even different weapons. Her attacks are faster and she even has more aerial options. In my opinion, Lucia was more fun to play as than Dante because she felt like she had higher combo potential and better movement options. Lucia's campaign is shorter than Dante's, with Dante having 18 missions and Lucia having 13. She gains different ranged options, but the Devil Trigger equips are the same as Dante's. The stages are pretty linear, and despite there being more variety in enemies and bosses, some of them are uninspired. Honestly, having magicians, tanks, helicopters, and a building giant is pretty boring. They even brought back Phantom, who doesn't say a single thing to Dante. I'm not too sure what they were doing with the bosses. Heck, the second to last boss is just an amalgamation of all the bosses you fought before, including Griffin from the first game for some reason. Easy and normal are both selectable at the start of the game, with hard being unlocked after normal is beaten with both Dante and Lucia. Beating hard mode with Lucia gets you Lucia Must Die, and by beating hard mode with Dante, you unlock Dante Must Die mode, and unlock Trish as a playable character. She actually gets her first playable appearance in this game, and plays a bit differently than Lucia or Dante. Other rewards you get for beating these modes are costumes for both characters and Bloody Palace, which should be a familiar sight to fans of the series. There's secret missions like in DMC1, but unlike DMC1's secret missions that ask the player to complete a specific challenge, the ones in DMC2 are just rooms filled with enemies that you have to defeat. Every single secret mission in DMC2 is the same type of mission, which is pretty disappointing to me. DMC2 is definitely the low point of the series, and after playing it even for a little bit, it becomes pretty apparent why. Visually, the game looks better than the first one, and I can kind of see what they were going for the setting, but it doesn't quite stick the landing. The story isn't anything special, and people often chastise Dante for being brooding and boring, but that's not really the case. His sarcastic and playfulness is still there, it's just a lot more subtle. And he's got some pretty good one-liners, and he still likes messing with people. Throughout the whole game, he's been messing with everyone whenever he flips his coin because he's using a double-sided coin. The fact that it looks like a silhouette of Trish is a little weird though. The combat has something interesting in there, but it's buried under a plethora of problems. It's not even a particularly hard game. In fact, the further I got into the game, the more I found myself feeling bored or annoyed by running through sections with constantly respawning enemies. I spent most of my time shooting my guns waiting to dodge a boss's attack instead of going in and actually trying to hit them with my melee attacks. Losing the ability to dodge or jump out of moves is extremely frustrating. I cannot stress this enough when I say that it leaves the player feeling powerless when it happens because they can see an attack coming but they can't do anything about it in time. With that said, it does introduce some important concepts that will be incorporated into the future Devil May Cry games, like Twosome Time, Rainstorm, Million Stabs, and Firecracker, along with items and concepts like the gold orbs and white orbs, and quick weapon switching, and the Bloody Palace. The game itself is pretty easy even on harder difficulties, but bosses can kind of be damage sponges in the later levels, especially that second to last boss. As a whole, I think the bad outweighs the good in DMC2. It's not even that it's a particularly bad game, it's more that everything comes together to make it a boring to an okay game with a combat system that's like, maybe a silver in the rough. Which, for some people, a boring game is worse than a bad game, and I can understand that. DMC2 is pretty easy to obtain with the DMC HD collection that came out recently for PC, PS4, Xbox One, and the HD collection was already out for PS3 and Xbox 360. And if you're wondering, the controls are the same between the PS2 version of the game and the HD version of the game. With all that said though, I can't recommend DMC2 to new players, and equally, I can't recommend it to veterans unless you really want to try and mess with the combo system. Alright, that's going to be it for this review. I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you later.
Your swan song will.
That macho